All right. Cool. Welcome back. This is second session of the year, as y'all probably are aware of. And just before we start off, we want to we have a quick two announcements. Anthony, if you want to do your thing.
Yeah, I'm about to ping all of you probably because you're probably all in GPC for not joined. Um, it is the official announcement for the Mechanics Jam, which is going to be a small game jam, um, something like 30 hours in length, something like that, where you basically focus on making a specific game mechanic around various themes, and you can make the mechanic by yourself as a solo programmer or with a couple of other artists or sound designers. Um, we don't recommend that you work with another programmer just because the scope of this is so small. I seriously doubt that you could split up the work like that. But yeah, the goal is to make a really polished mechanic that's expandable, something that you can code and you can look at the code and be proud of the code. But everything else too, if you want to bring some friends to do sound design or art, that would be good for them too, for experience, portfolio, whatnot. Um, and who knows, maybe you could take that mechanic you make and then find a use for it in some game or something. And in terms of platform or game engine, you can use whatever you want. You're gonna probably build for Windows, ideally build for web. And in terms of time, it's happening 7 p.m. Friday to midnight on Sunday, with some checkpoints between. But we'll get back to you guys on that soon. I'm gonna make an announcement with literally everything I just said in text form, and it's got the sign up link as well. So if you're interested, it will be in the announcements channel of GPC.
I have a question.
Yep.
Yep.
Uh, like how much background in programming or coding do we need to?
Absolutely zero.
Oh, okay,
You can join regardless of whether you program or not.
okay.
All right. With that out of the way, and since Hamraj isn't here, I guess I'll be the GDSA rep. Um, the GDSA Game Jam was announced. Sign up for that if you want. Highly recommend it. They're always a great time. This one is going from the 8th at 7 p.m. until the 10th of October at 8 p.m., I believe. So 100% sign up for that. You don't need to have a team going in. So if you go in needing a team, you'll find a team. You'll find people that you will jam with and jive with. It's great time, great chance to meet people, and awesome time to improve your skills. So yeah, sign up for the mechanics jam. Sign up for the game jam. Alrighty, with that out of the way, um, yeah, going into the basics of game sound. This one's gonna be doing a bit of a deeper dive on some of the stuff we talked about last week. I really hope you brought a drink because it's probably gonna be a long one. Um, so naturally, let's just start with a quick refresher on some of the stuff we went over last week. So, SparkNote's version of it, there's three main sound rules directly related to making sound for games. There's sound designers, composers, and voiceover artists. Each of them has a ton of subcategories that go under them, but that's the gist of it. We'll get into that today. Um, and we went over some software and hardware needed to slap sound in your game, mainly being an editor or a digital audio workstation. We gave a bunch of free choices to start. You can find those in the resources folder or resources channel on Discord. Um, we talked a bit about middleware like Fmod and Wise. Um, and we recommended have a decent microphone to record, pretty decent headphones to listen to stuff, and you'll be laughing from there. And so, like I just said a minute ago, we're going to be expanding on the sound rules part of it mostly today. So these three big things at the bottom there. So before we get right into the rules, let's just start by doing a quick little thinking about sound in games real quick. Um, and really just emphasize the amount of layers that even a simple game can have. So you got something like Mario with this juicy 240p image. Um, there's only about 10 sound effects in the entire game, or at least in the first couple levels. There's three music loops that I listen to. There's the end of level stinger that happens when you grab the flag, and obviously there's no voiceovers in the game. The soundscape is super open, not at all busy. Pretty much every sound has their own space to breathe, mainly due to all the limitations that were in place back in the day. That made it really difficult to make expansive soundscapes that we see today. So a lot of concessions had to be made, like the creative reuse of sounds, like the star power sound that's reused a couple times. Music loops that only have a couple layers to them, and obviously they're just loops for one area, and unique sound effects only for the most important things. So just going over a couple things real quick, we got the jump sound, you got the coin sound, mushrooms, the one ups, landing on enemies, fireballs, hitting a block, grabbing the flag, and going down a pipe. Like those are some of the sounds you hear. And then you got the main level music, you got the star power music, and the underground loop, as well as the end of level stinger that does that. So completely different example. You got something like Escape from Tarkov, where a game like this can have hundreds of sounds playing at any given moment, along with dynamic effects that are piled onto it, like when an explosion happens nearby and all the mid-high sounds get dulled, and everything's super like bassy and low, or when you're inside of a tunnel and there's reverb applied. All that stuff is usually applied in real time. So games like this, like modern military shooters and a lot of modern games these days, tend to focus a lot on realism, with a lot of the sounds being diegetic in the case of Tarkov specifically. And with hardware improving since Mario came out, obviously, pretty accurate simulations are possible on such a large scale. And in return, this creates a super immersive experience for you. Um, so just kind of giving it the same treatment. There's really minimal music in Tarkov, uh, pretty much just playing on death and in menus. But in terms of the sound effects, very much unlike Mario, there's a lot more than 10 sounds. So there's ambiances for pretty much every level, depending on the weather, location you're at in the level, and the time of day. There's unique object sounds for stuff like engines and motors. You got alarms, glass breaking. You got waves lapping in a level. Each character, so every single person that is playing the game, every single NPC, they have 2 feet. The feet make footstep sounds, and depending on the surface they're on, depending on how fast they're moving, depending on whether or not they're injured or not, all of that will change the sound. You got different gun sounds for all the gunshots, different attachments, different guns, different ammo, um, different reloading sounds. There's just a ridiculous amount of sounds that pretty much all fall under the diegetic kind of umbrella. And then there's all the non-diegetic stuff like UI elements and that sort of thing. And then there's also minimal voiceover, so a bit more than Mario because Mario has none. But you got NPCs doing callouts. You got all the pain sounds that players make and death sounds. So as you can tell, that's a lot of sounds. And remember, all of these can be playing at any point. So it's a lot to keep track of. Very, very thick soundscape. And just for one more example, that's a bit of a different take on the FPS genre. And to just, shill this game that I love so very much for you, um, you got Doom Eternal. So it's a pretty arcadey shooter. Um, and as you can probably tell by the giant muscly dude missing a huge chunk of his leg, it's not super focused on realism, being a pretty big departure from something like Tarkov. But like Tarkov, it uses sound to the absolute fullest extent. So there's any given level, there's three main tracks that can play for music. There's the ambient music that isn't super heavy or anything, mainly just to kind of drive you pushing forward. And then there's the light combat, which is pretty intense despite the name being light, which gets the blood flowing. And then you got the heavy combat, which is usually the most intense parts of any particular track. And each of these sections, or each of these tracks rather, have a crazy amount of sections that will be randomly chosen to play, with each of them usually being a couple bars in length, before picking another one randomly. So this adds a ridiculous amount of variety to the music. This is adaptive music. We'll get into this at some point in the future. And yeah, this amount of adaptivity to what you're doing and randomization when you're playing, it really pushes the "you are a badass" chemicals into your brain, while at the same time keeping it fresh enough so that you're like, yeah, this feels awesome, but I've heard this riff about 60 times now. I'm getting kind of sick of it. So there's a lot of that in Doom Eternal. It's great. But along with the music, you got all the sound effects that'll be going at all times. And being a really arcadey shooter, pretty much all of them are really, they really punch through the mix. They always convey information to the player, to save them from looking at a different spot on the screen in case there's a Hell Knight in their face. With all the recharging elements making a different sound when they charge, alerting the player. You got the unique demon sounds and weak points, which stand out really well, once again, to alert the player. So, like Tarkov, ridiculous amount of sounds, but mainly focused on more non-diegetic things, or even if they are diegetic, it's a lot more gamey. So the footsteps, there's really minimal surface variety, and there's really minimal variation. I think there's only 3 or 4 footstep sounds, but since it's heavy metal blaring, you got demons screaming in your face, you're probably not going to hear the footsteps too often. But you got the environmental ambience, like in this image, you see the lava shooting everywhere. That makes a sound. You got explosions making sounds. You got the jumping and dashing sounds. The different guns you have, the different weapon mods that you're using, the sound of the projectiles hitting the demons. That makes a pretty big sound. And then there's the weak point sounds, which really stand out. They're a really high-pitched kind of ping sound, because they can happen after a quick delay. So if that happens, you're looking away, you hear that sound, and you're like, okay, cool, I broke a weak point. Now cool, I don't need to worry about the Mancubus's rockets anymore, or flamethrowers, or something like that. And like I said, all the recharging sounds for everything alert the player. It's great. And then you got the voiceover, narration, as well as the environmental voiceover, that are found in the levels. So, what was the point of all this? You could be like, yeah, this guy just wants to talk about Doom, and while you'd be absolutely right, at the same time, just wanted to demonstrate how at any point in time, every single sound that is playing comes through the same 2 speakers, for headphones and stereo speaker setups, and all of them are always layered on top of each other to build the full soundscape, which is what you just hear in totality in the game. So not every game will be like Tarkov, where it's super immersive, 99% of the audio is diegetic. And similarly, not every game will be like Doom Eternal, with the soundtrack being the main driving force of the game. And again, not every game will be like Mario, where it can get away with just having a couple sounds and a couple loops of music, that are just a few bars long, yet everything fits perfectly. But one thing that all 3 do have in common is that beyond having sound, the mixing was necessary to bring each to the point that it's at, where you can parse out important sounds in the soundscape and glean information from it. So this picture down below is just a good visual representation of what I mean, with how many audio sources can be even in a simple scene, and just that it's always something to be super conscious of. And ultimately, no matter what role you play in the creation of sound in your game, all of it will eventually blend together to create one cohesive whole. Um, we will talk about mixing in a lot more detail later on, so we'll leave mixing at that for now. Um, but on the opposite end of everything being part of one soundscape, you're really going to need to develop your ears at some point, um, sooner the better, to really parse through and really hear each and every sound individually, since that's pretty integral to mixing. But it can also be a great indicator of what even needs to be there in the first place. Because being able to identify individual sounds in a large mix is pretty useful in music as well as sound design, but it's really difficult. Um, and just listening and distinguishing the instruments and their parts, while listening to and absorbing the larger whole, that's pretty much just what mixing is. Um, so it's a super important skill to acquire. It can take a while. So I'd say just start by listening to one or two distinct elements. Really try to hear those, listen to them the whole way through. Then try to go for the deeper sounds that are a bit more buried. And you can do that with music. You could do that for games, movies, TV shows, literally anything that has sound. And it can really help train your ears that way. All right, and on that note, let's hop on over to look at the sound design aspect of the soundscape. So, sound design, super broad term. So, like last week, we're going to take a bit of a look at the roles that fall under it, and then we'll go from there. So, like we talked about last week, there's pretty much two big sound design roles, which are Foley artists and field recordists, which do often get mixed up. But the main distinction is that Foley is recording stuff in a studio setting, usually indoors, and usually demands some unique sounds that will then be turned into what you want them to sound like. So if I was banging on a pot or pan or something, and then I tweaked it and turned it into like a gunshot or something, weird example, but you could do that. That would be an example of Foley if I did it um, in a studio indoor environment. Whereas you got something like field recording, which is generally going out of the studio with a giant mic with a big windsock on it and recording right in the thick of things from the source. This usually includes stuff like live weapons at ranges, vehicles, none of which we'll have the resources for in this program, which it makes me sad. But in the future, that might be something you'll get lucky enough to do. You could do environmental ambience out there, really anything you can think of. But there is a third type that doesn't really have a name beyond sound designer, because it kind of deals with creating the sound from scratch, usually either through noise generation or synths, just to get the right sound that they want. And all three of these kind of sub roles will generally include being an editor as well. So whichever way it's sliced, the purpose of sound design and the role of it in games comes down to two things most often. Either informing the player of the game state or valuable information, or increasing the player's immersion in the game world. Whether it's diegetic or not, whether it's super gamey or not, none of that really matters. If it's in there, it should either serve one of these two purposes. And if it doesn't, chances are pretty high then it doesn't need to be there, and you can save memory, you can save time, and you can save a bit of audio space in the mix by not having it. Ooh. 1 second, I need a drink. Ooh, all right. So, beyond the roles part of it, here's what the roles do. You're out there, you're recording sounds. What do you do with them? I would say, and from what I've seen, a lot of industry people would say, always keep the sounds that you've recorded and edited, because you really never know if you're going to need it at some point. So you might as well have it and start to build your sound library as early as you can. I started building my sound library in the middle of second year, and it's grown to, I want to say, around 2,000 files at this point, and it just keeps growing exponentially. It's kind of scary. Um, but you never know when you're gonna need it. If I need footsteps for pretty much any terrain now, I can just go in and listen to a couple hundred files of just footsteps because I went out, I recorded way too many footstep sounds, and boom, I've got those now. I can use them if I want. So it's super useful to build up a library. You're going to want to do that. Um, this may sound like a given with a lot of this stuff being expensive as it is, but keeping your gear clean is extremely important. So when recording in a studio, make sure that there's like a separate either control room, that's the fancy way of saying it, but even if you just close the door or something, and go to a different room when you're throwing a piece of concrete down and recording it, um, just doing something like that to keep things clean can really help. And one thing I actually do is I have a towel in my field recording bag uh, that I kind of lay down. I put stuff on, and that just keeps everything a bit cleaner. So that's something I would highly recommend. It's it's honestly probably saved my field recorder a few times. Um, so yeah, highly recommend that. Next thing is is a big one. Always be mindful of background noise when you're recording. Because even if you're in an enclosed room, if you listen closely, you'll always hear, or you'll almost always hear something. Like unless you're in a super treated room, or a sound booth or something, chances are you're either gonna hear like a fan, you're gonna hear some electrical humming, um, that sort of stuff. And if you're recording outside, you're really quickly gonna develop an extreme hatred for cars, planes, helicopters, and construction sites. Because all of those can be heard for like kilometers and kilometers. Even if you're in the middle of a forest, in the middle of nowhere, there will still probably be distant cars being picked up. It is incredibly frustrating, and it can ruin recordings if you're not prepared for it. Um, because of this and all the other many factors that could interfere, there's only really two factors that you do have control over. And those are two things that you should always try to keep in mind. It's where and when you record. So naturally, if you want it to be quiet, going out in the middle of the night, or at some crazy early time, like 4 a.m. or something, um, or just being extremely remote in the middle of nowhere, that will alleviate some of these issues, getting you much better results at a little expense of a bit of your sanity every time you go. But like I said, it gets you better results. For in-studio stuff, there's also the possibility of extraneous noise. So acoustic treatment is a must-have. Whether it's big bass traps or even just a bit of foam or even just opening your closet and recording in there. Um, so doing that, just anything to filter out a bit of noise, super useful. Um, yeah, or even just putting up a blanket on your walls that can help as well. I had blankets over my two windows throughout most of last summer, when we were in lockdown, and while I partially did that to block out the sun because I had inverted my sleep schedule from playing way too much Halo, it also really helped with any recording I was doing. So that's something you could do. Yeah, there's a really good reason that there's memes about YouTubers recording videos in their closet because it does work. So if you need to do it, definitely try it. So with all this talk about background noise, there's two main types that you're gonna want to keep an eye out for or an ear out for. Um, you got continuous and random. So continuous noise, that's mainly being stuff like fans, humming of hard drives, or like a fridge, or those big fluorescent tube lights. Those get pretty noisy. Anything that's consistent. Um, and for that kind of stuff, they can be a bit of a pain, but you can get around a good chunk of it with creative use of EQ. And noise reduction software will really be your friend to get rid of even more. If it's something quick, you can always edit around it. Excuse me, and then clean it up with EQ later. Noise gates will also eliminate the possibility of extremely quiet sounds making their way in there. And that'll give you a much crisper sound as well. And then just adding a touch of reverb will make it sound a bit more real, and mask a bit more of the noise. And then random noises, that's stuff like somebody walking around, you got voices that are kind of distant, somebody typing on a keyboard, or the odd distant car. Again, you can get around a lot of this in the same way, so that sort of thing is something to always keep in mind. So with that tangent out of the way, let's briefly get into the whole making the sound part. So you got creating libraries, creating sounds, editing them, and a whole lot more. Just right off the top, cool sounds can genuinely come from anywhere. Uh, the entire genre of industrial rock exists. One of the profs, and he actually came in last year for a guest speaker appearance. Rom DePrisco, he's an industry professional. And last year he did tell us that he used his washing machine for a song. He sampled that. And then you got crazy people like Mick Gordon using a chainsaw on his lawnmower for the Doom soundtracks. So you can really use pretty much anything as long as it sounds good. And speaking of using anything, you should absolutely use libraries. They're a great thing that exists. They have hundreds and hundreds of professional grade sounds if you find the right ones. With all the hard work of recording them, cleaning, and editing already being done for you. That being said, however, some sounds tend to be a little overused, and when noticed can pull the player out of the experience. So just a quick little example, something that came up in the game dev server a little while ago. But Halo Combat Evolved back in 2001 used a lot of sound libraries for most of its sounds. Since at the time it wasn't literally Xbox's brand. So, they were just developing a game, they used sound libraries, they put it in, cool. But, being the game that kind of started this whole series, a lot of those sounds became really iconic. So when the new Tom Clancy game shows off a turret or a rifle that has the exact same sound as the now iconic Halo turret, it was noticed by a pretty decent chunk of the internet. But that being said, using stock sounds, using stock libraries is a great stepping off point, especially for prototyping and putting in placeholders. But taking that, and if you have the rights, editing, layering, and adding effects to it, doing all that can really make it your own, and it can really separate it from sounds that might be heard somewhere else. And that way, it'll make it your own. So on that note, you got editing. Really huge thing. It is always better to oversave than to go back and need a clean version and not have it. So one thing I've seen is save at every step. So let's say you apply a reverb, cool, save it, save a copy of it. And then cool, every time you add a new effect, want to try something new, you make a new copy of it. And that way, let's say you screwed up like 10 steps back, like, oh no, I shouldn't have applied that reverb, this sounds way too messy. You can go back and do that. If you were picking up the work the next day or something with fresh ears and you're like, wow, that sounds horrible, what was I doing? You can go back, no harm, and it's there. So yeah, definitely always save often. And kind of in that, layering sounds and even randomizing the individual layers that can play can really add a ton of unique sounds just from a few to start out with. And that's one of the beauties of game sound in particular. Because, in a movie you can't make this one gun sound change every time you hear it because it'll play and that's how it plays. That's how it is in the movie. But with games, you can be like, okay, the player can shoot this at any point. The enemies can shoot it at any point. You might as well make it a bit unique instead of just hearing the same sound over and over again. So let's just take a shotgun, for example. You got a gunshot sound and then the pumping to load the next one. it's super simple, but that's just two sounds put together. And then from there, you can go, okay, there's two gunshot sounds and then two pumping sounds. That makes four different combinations. And from there, you can just keep adding and adding more. And that'll just give you a ridiculous amount of variation. Super useful. And it makes it sound a lot more complex than it actually is, which is great. We love that. Now, these next few things kind of fall under the and more part of the title. But something to keep in mind before you do any recording or anything is that there really is a hard limit to the amount of sounds you can have in a game. Even with games like Doom and Escape from Tarkov having an insane amount of sounds going on at once, a lot of clever tricks are used to ensure that it's not blowing up your RAM, or at least too often in Tarkov's case. So consideration should also, or should be given to the overall soundscape and how everything really blends together. So you should definitely make an asset list. Basically, that just ensures, okay, you don't forget anything. You really consider everything, like what needs to be there, what could, should, and must make noise in your game. And if you got something playable, try to do some placeholders, either from a library or throwing in voice, which is a funny thing. Like you shoot a gun and you hear someone say boom, or you hear an explosion and hear someone say boom. It's super easy way of prototyping, and it's definitely viable, especially when you're rapidly prototyping stuff. And kind of in line with that, creating a sound palette is super important as well, to really find the right tone and feel for the game. So that's basically just get a ton of sounds that are within the genre you want and narrow them down to even more, or narrow them down even more until you're left with just a handful that you can draw upon for inspiration. And using a couple sounds that really work, this will create a good theme orally. Orally is in AU, not O. And this will ensure that they all have similar qualities, and it'll get you inspired to do some creative work. And last but not least, try to over deliver. With all that creative work, try to have as many options as you can. I get that it's hard. It is hard. But having options to really nail down the right one for the job, it might even leave you with something that is perfect for something else. So you never know if you can reuse stuff. And at the end of the day, if it's not right for the project, cool. You got one more sound for your library. All right, I just realized I've been talking for about 30 minutes, so I'm going to try to speed through these next few. All right, so you got music composition up next. This is a fun one. So once again, there's quite a few more specific roles when it comes to music. So I'll just blast through them all really quick. You got the composer. They're the one that writes the music. The arranger takes that music and then makes it work for each instrument, voice, section, etc. You got the recording engineer. They're the one who hits record, but also monitors levels when recording, sets mics up, and does the tracking beforehand. You got the producer. They're in charge of how the final product will turn out. Usually the ones overseeing the engineers and works closely with the composer. You got the musicians, the ones that are performing it. Mixing engineer, the one who's going to be mixing it all to make a nice whole. The mastering engineer, they're mastering the final mix to make it in parity with the rest of the music and ensure that it plays back on a variety of systems very well. So the role of music in games generally is just to reinforce the tone and the atmosphere. And it helps build up the immersion of the experience, but it's also integral to the emotions that the player feels. So you take something like the climax of Lord of the Rings Return of the King at the Black Gate. That would be a huge moment, huge impact, even without the music. But with the music swelling where it does, that brings it from a 10 out of 10 moment to a 15 out of 10 moment. That'll just make you feel a whole lot of things. And on the same note, but for games, you get something like Halo 4's ending. Super emotional, but then you slap that music in, and it's raining all of a sudden. So music is really useful for making your player cry, but it can also hype them up, like with Doom. So you get something like Doom, has one very clear goal to empower the hell out of the player, and the music does that at every single chance that it has. Um, and yeah, it gets you to play aggressively. It informs your play style. So music of has a lot of capabilities for how you play the game, how you experience the game, and how you see the game. And the beauty of that is it can dynamically respond to moments in game. So that's how it makes itself unique, as opposed to stuff like film. It changes based on the player input, and you can use this to your advantage to really accentuate moments in your game and make them even more impactful. So a lot of this will be expanded on in a future session dedicated strictly towards adaptive music. So yeah, this will be expanded on, which I feel like I've been saying a lot this week and last week. So you got loops. They're arguably the most important part of music for games. Loops will encompass pretty much everything from the menus, a lot of the gameplay, and it doesn't matter if it's adaptive music or not, loops will be in there. And even outside of music, you got stuff like ambience for the level. That's a loop. Music loops, in essence, are just a musical pattern that can loop on itself seamlessly, as you'd expect from the name loop. But you got to watch out for the reverb tails when you're exporting stuff. That can be a bit of a pain. But they're super versatile because it's such a broad definition that you can really use them for anything. A lot of classic games, like the Mario example, they have just something like, okay, you start a level, cool, boom, it's one track that loops, and it ends when you finish the level. But then you get something like, Doom, where it's like, cool, it's looping this one section, and within that, there's a bunch of smaller loops, or a bunch of smaller parts that could loop, and from there, you get into the adaptive music kind of thing. But then the next step past that would be having transitional one-shots or stingers, which are things that play once all the way through, don't loop, and those can be used to smoothly blend between two tracks. And a lot of more modern games like the Halo trilogy, they use transitions like that all the time, and that's usually just a trigger in the game world, usually just a big collision box. You walk through it, and then it causes the current loop to play the stinger, and then goes into a different section, transitioning very smoothly. So music is also used to call attention to something, particularly with stingers and one-shots, because they can play over top of other loops. So you got something like Left 4 Dead playing a few notes to tell the player something pretty bad's coming. That's a great example of a stinger or a one-shot. But they can also, like I just said, include stuff like transitional pieces, tracks for cinematics or cutscenes, or one-time events in the game. So in the case of cinematics, that's the closest game music can get to film scoring, since that's essentially just what it is, having a scene and then writing a piece to match it. And then you got stuff like ambient tracks, which I'm going to include as music, because a lot of the time it's setting the atmosphere in a non-diegetic way, which is like music. And most of them are loops. So this kind of track would include stuff like the entire Quake soundtrack, super ambient, all the screams and like demonic noises from the Doom games, and stuff that you generally consider just like an ambient soundscape. And there's a lot of songs in particularly the progressive genres that have just a lot of weird atmospheric parts. Like Pink Floyd does that a lot. A band I've gotten into recently, the Mars Volta, does that a lot. And a lot of it is just to build anticipation and atmosphere. So on the opposite end of that, you got musical tracks, exactly what you'd expect. They're music. It could be loops, it could be stingers, they could be one-shots, really anything that strikes your fancy. So then, wrapping those up and putting a little bow on them, you got two boxes. One of them says linear music, one of them is adaptive music. They're the sum of all these parts, And super basic overview of these, because again, we're going to have a huge session on both of these. Um, Linear music is the type of music you listen to all the time. It starts the same, always ends the same, always is the same all the way through. This does include loops. This includes one shots. This includes stingers, trailer music, cutscenes, and all of these things, they're used for adaptive music. So that's basically the kind of music that is pretty much only found in games or interactive media, as they, as you'd expect from the term adaptive, they respond to what the player does. And this could be as simple as having two loops that crossfade with each other when you go to a new area, or as complex as adding in additional layers of instrumentation, like bongos when you jump on Yoshi, or applying effects when your health is low, and randomly selecting different parts to play. Again, going to go into this a lot more depth in the future, so sit tight with that. And there's right there at the bottom, you'll see interactive music. It is different from adaptive music. It's super similar, but it generally refers to stuff like rhythm games, like Guitar Hero, where the player interacts directly with the audio. So you screw up a note in Guitar Hero, that'll change how the song sounds. That's interactive music. So really expanding on your musical knowledge by listening to a ton of different genres can really open you up to a ridiculous amount of possibilities that you may have never considered before. So this is something I would definitely take and run with. So writing music with only knowledge of, say, one genre will limit you to writing something that will, more often than not, sound like that genre. But if you've got a bit of jazz thrown in there, boom, you created a new hybrid. Two very different genres mixing together. Cool. You got something that's yours. But yeah, the more cookie jars you open, the wider palette you'll have on your plate, the more cookies you can eat, the more good flavors you can mix together. And yeah, a lot of cool stuff can come from that. Kind of along with that, getting reference examples is a perfect way to establish a basic outline of what you want to achieve. So even just picking a handful of sounds or a handful of songs, and then narrowing down specific elements about them, and then working with that to make it your own is super necessary to build up a musical sound palette for your game. So that's definitely something great to do, and it will always help you. If you have a clear idea of what purpose the music will serve in the game, another thing is knowing when the track you're working on fits perfectly. So if it's Animal Crossing, the music probably isn't going to be speed metal. Chances are it'll be something chill, super vibey, pretty slow tempo, kind of easy listening, that sort of thing. And if vice versa, if you're working on a boomer shooter, it'll be the opposite. You're probably not going to go for lo-fi beats to study to. You're going to want something that feels like you just snorted G Fuel. You're going to want something energetic, fast, frantic, and just super aggressive. So the earlier you figure out its purpose, the better it'll turn out and the more it'll work for your game. And on the same line as that, each instrument in the actual track should have a distinct purpose in the song as well, especially if they're in the same register. So you got something like a piano and an acoustic guitar, for example. Both usually occupy the mid-range in a piece. So if the guitar's doing like a flurry of notes up high, getting the piano to lay down the bass can really separate the two. Or if the piano's doing some kind of Billy Joel thing, or like a ragtime kind of feel maybe, getting the guitar to just strum chords will make it a bit more percussive, while the piano adds a bit more tonality to the actual notes being played. So a couple ways to distinguish them. But yeah, if they're both doing the same part, there should be a good reason for it. Either like, okay, really punch the player in the face. Like, this is a really important part. You are supposed to feel this in your soul. Like, that's a good reason for it. Just really emphasizing something is generally a great reason for a lot of unison parts. But otherwise, I would generally say try to have roles defined for each of the instruments. So listening to a lot of music is one thing, but actually transcribing it, learning the different parts and analyzing it, and just really looking at what makes it tick is then the next step. So there's a ton to get into with that sort of thing, like lead sheets, Roman numeral analysis, full transcriptions, remaking the track if you're crazy. But a good starting point that requires next to no musical knowledge is just listening to the track really critically a few times, completely undistracted, just listening for each of the parts, trying to hear different things you never heard before, and all just the different little subtleties. And like with adaptive music, I can only go into so much depth with this, so a good chunk of this detail will come later, with all the musical terminology and all that good stuff. And the last of the big three, you got voiceovers. This will cover pretty much everything related to voice in games. So, when it comes to voiceovers in games, there's a pretty small handful of roles, but all of them are super vital. So if you're doing anything that's the sound stuff for a game, there's a pretty good chance that you'll have a hand in at least writing the script. So this can be anything from a few lines for certain situations to full-on voiceover narration to thousands of lines of dialogue for NPCs in an RPG, which, let's be real, that's probably beyond the scope of anything in this program, but wanted to address it anyways. So for myself at least, my team's second year game was an FPS that only had a handful of characters. But in the end, we ended up just having a few lines, a few variations for each situation, and it eventually got to the point where there were almost 560 individual voice files. And on the complete flip side of that, our third year game, that we're currently still working on, it just has voiceover narration, but it has a script of over a few pages long and well over 20 minutes of dialogue. So no matter what the project is, if it has voiceover work, a script is definitely necessary to nail it down. Now, you got the person reading the script, the voice actor. This could be you, this could be a friend that's good at accents or voices, or this could be someone who does this professionally. Whatever the case is, their job is to read the lines in a way that will fit in perfectly with the tone, the mood, and the character. Then you got the voice director. They're the one who directs the voice actors. They're the ones who add any additional context to the lines. They're the ones that listens to the performance to ensure that they're doing the best they can, and directs them in the right path if they're not. Then you got the recording engineer. Once again, they're the ones that monitors the levels, hits the big red button, and makes sure everything sails smoothly. And once again, you got the editor. They're the ones that'll take the session file, chop it into pieces, clean it up, apply effects to it, and gets it game ready by being the mixing and mastering engineer as well. So, shockingly, the role of voice in a game is usually to deliver information to the player, which is usually the story. But good voice work and great voice work can really increase the immersion of a player and deepen the emotional connection to the players. So, just like how there's different types of sound and different types of music, there's a couple different ways voiceover is used in games. So we'll just quickly go over them. Chief among them and most commonly seen and thought about is dialogue. So dialogue's great for providing story information, giving the player motivation, and adding to the realism and immersion. It also increases emotional investment from the player, and it does all that and so much more. Dialogue in this case mainly just refers to the in-universe dialogue spoken by characters in the game world physically, with narration being covered naturally by narration. So that's focused on getting a solid performance without any need about timing, or synchronizing to animations or anything like that, like dialogue might be. Narration, that's the stuff that's like kind of the voice of God kind of thing. That would be an announcer in a multiplayer game, or if you're playing Civ all night and the voice is telling you stuff, that's what the narration would be. Um, or if you got something like The Witcher 3, the cutscenes that are narrated by, um, I want to say Vesemir, but I'm 90% sure it's not. Crucify me if you will. But all that's narration. That's what that is. So, after all that, you got the vocal sound effects, which are the fun stuff. They're almost always diegetic in nature. That's the stuff like grunts, you got screaming, you got panting, all that fun stuff. All this stuff is generally done at the end of a session since it can really wreck your voice for a couple of hours, even when you're drinking some water. And last but not least, you got interface and accessibility voiceovers, which are becoming more and more of a thing with accessibility on the rise. So, wanted to address it. This would include any and all menu options being read out for visually impaired gamers. You got confirmation voice lines and other things like that. And are usually, as you'd expect, a toggleable option found under the accessibility options in the menu. This is a pretty big one that I don't see or hear about too often. And with game accessibility getting better with each coming year, and a lot that can be done to help that along, this is a good place to start. Since it's relatively simple, we could implement it, and it helps people. The Game Accessibility Guidelines website is super helpful when it comes to stuff like this that's audio related, and this is a big one. Now, moving on to what a general voiceover session would look like. Alright, so this one's kind of fun. I just wanted to do kind of a step-by-step to show how I've done it in the past, how industry pros have done it, and just kind of a super simple, generalized voiceover session, just so you don't make any mistakes that I did or others did. So this does include stuff that happens before the session and after the session, but we're mainly focusing on the session itself. Session doesn't sound like a word anymore. Unless you're ad-libbing everything, you're probably going to want a script to read off of. Writing this first ensures that not only you have something to go off of, but you can make sure that it works with the game. You can double check, like, okay, this doesn't conflict with anything. Cool, it's written down. They know what to read. It works. So once you have all the lines written down and where the lines will be used, this will make it easier to direct the actor, but also easier for you to edit them later. Being able to group lines together based on what triggers them in game, or different other ways that you want to group them together. So after getting the script written and polished, you're going to want to find people to record it. So personally, I've used my team members. I've used friends that I've played D&D with, that do great voices, and I've recorded myself way too many more times, more times than I'd like. And I have a few friends that are into acting that are interested in providing anything in the future. So since we're students, we're making student games, we don't necessarily have money to spend on real professionals. Getting your friends and people you know to record stuff can be really fruitful if they're good enough. Next thing, I'm definitely feeling this one because my throat is getting very dry. Always have water bottles, not just for yourself, but always make sure that the actor stays hydrated. Nothing changes a voice faster than a dry throat, and you're probably already hearing that. So being a dry, or not having a dry throat, being a hydro homie, that's the way to go. Always drink water. And it can get really hot doing this since fans make noise and you don't want noise. So it can get really hot. Always drink water. Stay hydrated. And kind of in a similar vein to this, having as few people on hand as possible when you're doing the recording is ideal for a couple of reasons. It helps keep the actor a bit more relaxed if they're somebody else other than you. It ensures a better performance that way. It also reduces heat, which, like I just said, is really necessary because it gets hot. and it reduces a bit more possibility for background noise. So even just a group of yourself and the actor, that's honestly more than enough. And that'll cover pretty much everything a good chunk of the time, since you're more than likely gonna be doing all the roles. Um, so you got the script, you got the people, you got a gallon of water. What next? You get more water, and then you set up the equipment, preferably before the actor arrives. But if not, that's fine. Um, and then you hit record as soon as everything is set up to go. Getting everything set properly with sound checks and doing a quick sound test, um, like a little quick test recording, are great ways to spot any issues that might arise. Um, and always try to record the entire session because you never know what you might miss if you try to record individual takes. In a similar scenario, I was recording sounds for our second year game with a few friends, and even though we tried to time everything properly, um, the sound of us smashing a watermelon with a crowbar was partially cut off from one of the hits. It ended up being fine in the end, but if we had recorded the entire session front to back, um, it would have been a ton to edit, but nothing would have been missed. Um, Now back to the voice part of it. Always try to get multiple takes per line, and by that I mean correct takes that don't have fumbling over words or anything like that. So having around 2 to 5, 3 is usually a good number to settle on. Um, wow, you can really tell that I. Whew. All right. Yeah, having 3 good takes to settle on, with a couple different inflections, it gives you honestly more than enough variety to pick from. Longer sentences and monologues can be a bit more difficult, especially when doing a voice. Um, but all of it does come down to practice. Then right at the end of the session, you're gonna want to let loose a bit, do all the death sounds, all the yells, screams, all that fun stuff. Ending the session with that ensures that the actor gives it their all without compromising any lines due to wrecked throat. Um, and always, again, have water on hand after that. It hurts. Um, and yeah, 2 more super quick things. Try to get all the lines for a character recorded in one session if you can. Consistency is really important, and it's fairly obvious when someone's either trying to do the voice, or doing it. So it's better to just get it done all at once to keep the uniformity. Um, I know this very well because with a lot of the narration I've been doing for our game, um, I would do it on a level by level basis, and then I would do a good chunk of it for data pads you can collect, and all of it kind of sounded different. So I had to go back, recorded all of it in one day. It was tiring. It was a very long day, but now all of it's super uniform. All of it's edited the same way. All of it sounds the same way because I'm doing the same voice. Um, and yeah, all of it's just super uniform. That's the way to go. Super useful. And now for the last one. It's kind of my mantra at this point, but once you've got the full unedited wave, you stop the recording, you're going to want to make a copy immediately, and that's the one you're going to do all the editing on. Um, but yeah, always save backups and always save the raw files. They're important, and you'll never know if you need them until the project's done, and that's at the absolute earliest, because even then, you might need it later. Oh, all right. So I've been talking a while now. With those 3 giant info dumps out of the way, thank you for listening. I hope that helped give you a bit of an understanding of the different roles that audio in a game plays and the different roles assigned to the people that do it. Um, we covered a ton of ground today, but as always, there's always a ton more to cover. So please let us know of anything you'd be interested in seeing expanded on. Um, but yeah, hope that helped. And just to cap it off, next week, or this week, thanks for coming out. But next week, we'll be running a session on game jams and how to, just a few things to get you ready for the first game jams coming up. So once again, we got the GDSA Fall Game Jam on the horizon. That's the 8th to 10th. and then you got the GPC Mechanics Jam around that time as well. It's the perfect time to head first or dive headfirst into what it's like doing a game jam in the world of game sound. Yeah, we hope to see you there next week as well as the game jam. Thanks for coming out.